On August 29, 1884, the Royal Navy gunboat HMS Mallard was patrolling the grey waters off the coast of Newfoundland when her lookout spotted a brig drifting between Baccalieu Island and the town of Catalina at the northern tip of Conception Bay. The ship was moving erratically, not sailing but drifting, her course dictated by the wind and the current rather than by anyone at the helm. The Mallard signaled and received no reply. It signaled again. Nothing. The officers trained their glasses on the deck of the drifting vessel and saw no movement, no crew, no sign that anyone was aboard. A boarding party was sent across. They climbed the side of the brig and stepped onto a deck that was deserted but not abandoned. Everything aboard the ship suggested that people had been there minutes ago. The fire in the galley was still burning. The lamps were lit. Food was set out on the cabin table, prepared and waiting to be eaten. The cargo was still in the hold, undisturbed. The logbook was open, and the last entry had been written no more than 6 hours before the Mallard arrived. It was a routine entry, recording course and conditions, with nothing to indicate distress or danger, or any reason why 11 people would walk away from a perfectly functioning ship in the middle of a calm sea. But they had. Captain John James, his crew of 7, and 4 passengers were gone. The lifeboat was missing, and in a locked compartment where the captain was known to keep a significant sum of gold coins, roughly 300 pounds, there was nothing. The gold was gone too. The ship was the SV Resolven, a merchant brig named after the village of Resolven in the Neath Valley of South Wales. She had been built as a cargo vessel, sturdy and functional, designed for the demanding Atlantic crossing rather than for speed or comfort. Her home port was Aberystwyth, a small harbour town on the west coast of Wales, where the mountains come down to the sea and the fishing boats go out in every kind of weather. Her primary route was between Wales and Canada, carrying timber eastbound and salt, and general cargo westbound. She was not a large ship. She was not a famous ship. She was the kind of vessel that kept the Resolven economy moving, one cargo at a time, crossing and recrossing the ocean with the steady reliability that the maritime trade demanded. Captain John James, from Newquay in Cardiganshire, had commanded her for years. He was a Welshman in an era when Welsh captains were common on the Atlantic routes. Men who had grown up in coastal villages where the sea was not a romantic abstraction, but a workplace, as familiar and as dangerous as a coal mine. James knew the ship. He knew the route. He knew the water. He had made the crossing to Newfoundland many times. He was experienced enough to understand the risks of northern waters, experienced enough to know what ice looked like and what it could do to a wooden hull, and experienced enough to know the difference between a ship that was in danger and a ship that was not. And on the last day of August 1884, he and everyone aboard vanished from the earth so completely that 140 years of investigation have produced only one body, one theory, and no definitive answer. The Resolven had arrived in Newfoundland in June of 1884, carrying a cargo of Mediterranean salt. She discharged her cargo and took on supplies in preparation for her next job, a run north to Snug Harbour, Labrador, to collect a shipment of cod destined for the European market. It was routine work, the kind of voyage the Resolven had made many times before. On the evening of Wednesday, August 27th, the Resolven departed Harbour Grace, a small port on the western shore of Conception Bay. She carried her crew of 8, including Captain James, and 4 passengers. The passengers were local Newfoundland men, residents of the Conception Bay area, who had booked passage on the Resolven for the trip north to Labrador. Their names and their reasons for traveling have been largely lost to history, but their presence would become central to the darkest theory about what happened. The Resolven passed the Baccalieu lighthouse around midnight and continued north. The weather was calm. The sea was moderate. There was nothing in the conditions to suggest danger. The last entry in the ship's logbook recorded a routine position and course, written in a steady hand, with no indication of distress. And then, sometime in the hours that followed, everyone aboard the Resolven disappeared. When the boarding party from HMS Mallard examined the ship on August 29th, they found a vessel that had suffered some damage, but nothing catastrophic. According to the Harbour Grace Standard, which published a detailed account of the discovery shortly afterward, the ship's stem was smashed, the rudder was unshipped, and the jib boom and bowsprit were both damaged. A large iceberg had been sighted in the area, and the most immediate theory was that the Resolven had struck ice. The impact could explain the damage to the bow and the rudder, but it did not explain why the crew had abandoned a ship that was still afloat, still intact, still carrying her cargo, and still warm. The iceberg theory became the official explanation, such as it was. Investigators thought the crew, many of whom were not accustomed to navigating in northern waters where icebergs were common, had been startled by a collision with ice. In the darkness and confusion, they panicked. They launched the lifeboat and piled in, all 11 of them, convinced that the ship was going to sink. The ship did not sink, but the lifeboat, overloaded with 11 people in the cold North Atlantic, swamped. Everyone drowned. The bodies were carried away by the current. The Resolven drifted on, her fire still burning, her lamps still lit, waiting for a crew that would never come back. It was a plausible theory. The water off Newfoundland is cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. An overloaded lifeboat in even moderate swells could easily capsize. Panic, the sudden overwhelming belief that the ship is going down, has caused crews to abandon perfectly seaworthy vessels throughout maritime history. The Mary Celeste, 12 years earlier, may have been abandoned for similar reasons. Her crew fled a ship they believed was about to explode, and then were unable to get back aboard when the danger turned out to be imaginary. The parallels between the Resolven and the Mary Celeste were so striking that the Resolven earned the nickname the Welsh Mary Celeste. Both were merchant brigs. Both were found drifting in good condition. Both had food and drink still set out. Both had lifeboats missing. Both had crews that were never seen again. The key difference was the gold. The Mary Celeste had no missing valuables. The Resolven did. The waters off Newfoundland had a long history of producing ghost ships. The cold, the fog, the icebergs, and the vast emptiness of the North Atlantic created conditions where ships could vanish and reappear without explanation. Crews were lost to sudden storms, to rogue icebergs that materialized out of fog banks, to capsized lifeboats, to simple miscalculations that put men in the water at temperatures that killed in minutes. The Resolven was not the first ghost ship found off Newfoundland. She would not be the last. But she was the one with the missing gold, and the missing gold changed the story from a tragedy into a crime. But the iceberg theory had problems. The damage to the Resolven was not severe. The ship was towed to port, refitted, and put back into service under a new owner and crew. If the damage had been serious enough to convince the crew that the ship was sinking, the ship should not have been so easily repaired. And the crew was not entirely inexperienced. Captain James had sailed the Atlantic for years. He knew what ice looked like. He knew what a damaged ship felt like. The idea that he would abandon a ship that was clearly not sinking, in calm weather, with a fire still burning in the galley, strained credibility. Then there was the gold. Captain James was known to carry a significant sum of gold coins aboard the Resolven, roughly 300 pounds, a substantial fortune, in 1884. When the Mallard's boarding party searched the ship, the gold was gone. A small package containing £100 was still aboard, along with the captain's gold watch, but the main stash of coins had disappeared. If the crew had abandoned ship in panic during an ice collision, they would not have had time or reason to take the gold. You do not stop to count coins when you believe you are about to drown. The missing gold suggested something else entirely. It suggested that the disappearance of the crew was not an accident. It was a crime. The theory that emerged, whispered at first, and then spoken openly in the years that followed, was that the 4 Newfoundland passengers had murdered Captain James and the crew for the gold. The passengers were local men who knew the coast intimately, who knew the waters, the currents, the tides, and the hidden coves where a lifeboat could land without being seen. They knew which communities asked questions and which ones did not. They knew how to disappear in a landscape that was designed for disappearing, a coastline of 10,000 inlets, bays, and islands, where a man who did not want to be found could live out his life in complete anonymity. They could have killed the crew, taken the gold, launched the lifeboat, and rowed to shore under cover of darkness, scattering into the communities of Conception Bay or Trinity Bay, where strangers were common during the fishing season, and questions were not asked as long as a man was willing to work. 4 men with £300 in gold could have started new lives in 4 different communities and never been connected to each other or to the Resolven again. It explained the missing gold. It explained why the lifeboat was gone. It explained why the ship was still in good condition, because no accident had occurred. The damage to the bow and rudder could have been caused by the ship drifting into ice after the crew was already gone. Or it could have been inflicted deliberately to support the fiction that the ship had struck a berg. And it explained something that the iceberg theory could not: why the fire was still burning and the food was still on the table. The crew had not abandoned ship. They had been taken from it. For over a century, that was where the mystery rested. No bodies were found. No survivors came forward. No confession was made. The Resolven was repaired, sold, and returned to service. 3 years later, in 1887, she was wrecked while carrying lumber from Nova Scotia back to Newfoundland. The ship that had carried 11 people to their deaths was itself destroyed, and the mystery should have died with it. It didn't. In 2015, a woman named Daisy Bailey from Newfoundland was browsing the internet when she came across a website run by a man named Will Wain. Wain was a writer living in North Wales. He was also the great-grandson of Captain John James. For over a decade, Wain had been researching the mystery of the Resolven, driven by a family story that had haunted 4 generations. The ancestor who sailed away and never came back. Wain had dug through archives in Wales and England. He had visited the National Archives in London, where he found the original log of HMS Mallard, the handwritten record confirming every detail of the discovery: the fire, the lamps, the food, the missing crew. He had searched shipping records, census data, and newspaper archives from the 1880s. He had traveled to Newfoundland to walk the coastline where the Resolven had been found. And he had posted everything on a website and a Facebook page, casting it out into the world like a message in a bottle, hoping that someone, somewhere, might have information that could explain what happened to his great-grandfather 130 years ago. Daisy Bailey was that someone. She told Wain a story that had been passed down through her family for generations. Not long after the discovery of the abandoned Resolven, her grandfather and his older brother had been on the coast of Random Island, a remote and sparsely populated island in Trinity Bay, roughly 60 miles from where the Resolven had been found drifting. Random Island in 1884 was a place of scattered fishing settlements connected by coastal paths and by boat, a place where strangers did not appear often, and where the arrival of an unknown man would have been noticed and remembered. On a hillside overlooking the sea, they found a body. The man was sitting beneath a tree, facing the ocean, as though he had been watching the water when he died. His posture was upright. He looked, according to the family story, as though he had simply sat down to rest and never stood up again. He was dressed in a captain's uniform, the kind of formal clothing that an officer would wear aboard a merchant vessel. He carried no identification, but he had on his person a distinctive white gold pocket watch, the kind of expensive personal item that a sea captain would own. The timing matched. The location matched. The uniform matched. The watch matched the kind of object that Captain John James, a man known to carry gold coins and valuable possessions, would have owned. Will Wain immediately recognized the significance. If the body on Random Island was Captain John James, then the captain had made it to shore. He had not drowned in a swamped lifeboat. He had reached land, and he had died there, alone, sitting under a tree, looking out at the sea that had taken his ship. But the story had another detail, and it was the detail that changed everything. According to Bailey, her grandfather and his brother had not reported the discovery to the authorities, and around the same time they found the body, the two men came into a notable amount of wealth that they had not previously possessed. If the body was Captain James, and if the captain's gold coins were on or near his person, then the men who found him had taken the gold and kept the secret. The captain had died with his money. The men who found him had buried the secret with him. The body was buried on Random Island. Will Wain traveled to Newfoundland to meet with Bailey and investigate. He located the approximate area of the burial. He found additional oral histories from the community that corroborated elements of Bailey's story. As of his most recent research, an exhumation of the burial site has been discussed but not yet carried out. The discovery of the body complicates every theory about the Resolven. If the captain made it to shore, did anyone else? Did the crew survive the lifeboat crossing and scatter along the coast, some dying, some disappearing into remote communities? There is another unconfirmed rumor from Newfoundland that a man lived for years in an isolated coastal settlement who may have been a survivor of the Resolven. That story has never been verified. Or did the passengers kill the crew at sea, take the gold, and row to shore, only for the captain to survive the attack, reach Random Island, and die of his wounds or exposure before he could reach help? If that is what happened, then the body under the tree is the last witness to a murder that was never investigated, never prosecuted, and never solved, because the only people who knew about it were the men who found his body and took his gold. The Resolven sits at the intersection of two mysteries. The first is the classic ghost ship question. Why was a perfectly good ship abandoned in calm waters with the fire still burning and the food still on the table? The second is a murder mystery. Who took the gold? And did the 4 passengers who boarded in Harbour Grace have anything to do with the disappearance of the captain and crew? The answer may be buried on Random Island, beneath a tree on a hillside that overlooks the sea. A man in a captain's uniform, carrying a white gold watch, sitting upright as though he had simply decided to stop and rest and look at the water one last time. He may be Captain John James of Newquay, Wales. He may be the last man to know what happened aboard the Resolven on the night of August 27th, 1884. And he may have been sitting there, watching the ocean, for 140 years. The fire has long since gone out. The lamps have long since burned down. The food on the table rotted and was cleared away by men who did not understand why it was there. The ship was repaired, sold, wrecked, and forgotten. But the captain, if it is the captain, is still on Random Island. Still sitting under his tree, still facing the sea. And no one has ever asked him what happened, because no one knew he was there until a woman in Newfoundland read a website written by his great-grandson and remembered a story her grandfather had told her about a body he had found and a fortune he had never explained. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There is always another ship that never came home.